All right, so today we're going to be diving into A Complicated Kindness by Miriam Toews. We've got this review here, and I'm really curious to kind of dig into what makes this book tick.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like a really fascinating read.
Yeah, I mean, it takes place in this strict Mennonite community, so right off the bat, it's a pretty unique setting.
Right, and just from the review, it sounds like it explores some pretty universal themes, too.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And one thing that really struck me was how the review calls the book poignant and often hilarious at the same time. It's like, how do you make people laugh when you're dealing with such serious subject matter, especially stuff like religious extremism?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with Toz's use of perspective. I mean, the whole story is told through the eyes of Nomi Nickel, this teenager who's kind of witty and rebellious.
Oh, interesting. So, like, her humor is how we experience the whole thing.
Exactly. Her observations are really sharp and her humor can be pretty dry. And so it kind of allows us to see the absurdity of some of the situations in the community. Like we can kind of laugh at the hypocrisy even while we're feeling for the characters.
Oh, I see. So it's not like, just silly jokes or anything.
Right. It's more about like her unique take on the world,
Right.
right? She's smart, but also kind of cynical in a funny way.
That makes sense. But I'm wondering, do you think her humor is more of a coping mechanism? Like
Here.
something she uses to deal with all the restrictions and maybe even losses she's experienced?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I definitely think there's a sense that her humor is kind of masking a deeper pain, like a feeling of not really belonging.
Yeah, yeah. And that kind of makes me think about some of the other themes that the review mentions. Faith, family, community, and identity. I feel like those are things that a lot of people can relate to, regardless of whether they've grown up in a strict religious community or not.
Hmm.
Like everyone wants to belong, everyone wants to figure out who they are.
Absolutely. And for Nomi, that struggle is made even more intense because she lives in this really closed off society. The review talks about the claustrophobia of the environment, and I bet you really feel that sense of being trapped as you read about Nomi trying to find her own way.
Yeah, I can totally see that. It makes me think of other historical examples or even cultural situations where individuals have kind of pushed against the norms of their society. Like, even though the setting is so specific, I bet Nomi's desire for freedom is something that a lot of people can relate to.
Totally. I think that's one of the things that makes her such a compelling character. She's intelligent, she's observant, and her voice, it's this really interesting blend of cynicism and vulnerability.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the review specifically talks about how Toes uses Nomi's quirky observations to kind of offer some moments of comic relief.
Yeah.
Can you think of a specific example of that, like how she injects humor into this otherwise pretty heavy narrative?
Sure. Well, one that comes to mind is when Nomi describes her town as a place where boredom and piety went hand in hand. It's kind of a simple line, but it just perfectly captures like her sardonic wit. And it kind of reveals how she sees through this like surface level stuff.
It's like that contrast, right? This kind of dark humor set against the backdrop of a community that's wrestling with some pretty weighty things like faith and tradition.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, because the review makes it clear that the book isn't just like a critique of religion or religious extremism, right? It's more nuanced than that.
Exactly, exactly. Toast doesn't really offer any simple answers or judgments. Instead, she portrays all these characters, even the ones who seem really strict or judgmental, with a lot of empathy.
Mm.
I think that allows us to see their struggles and how complex they are as people. Even within this really restrictive environment, you see love and loyalty and this deep desire for connection.
That's a good point. So it sounds like we've got this coming-of-age story set against this super unique backdrop. A protagonist who is both relatable and kind of makes you think, and then this, like, incredible balance of humor and serious themes.
Definitely.
And it makes you think, though, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you were actually friends with Nomi, what advice would you give her as she navigates this, like, crazy time in her life?
Oh, man, that is a good question.
Yeah, something to think about. Anyway, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into A Complicated Kindness. Hopefully this has kind of piqued your interest. Maybe you'll check out the book yourself, or maybe even just, take some time to reflect on your own experiences with faith, community, and finding your place in the world.
That sounds like a great idea.
Thanks again for joining us.
Of course, my pleasure.